Kia ora everybody and welcome back to Theology, where we drink tea and today we are continuing our discussion on the covenants, and we're still drinking lychee tea, though now it is lychee tea with a twist. It's lychee and rose tea, which is just my lychee tea mixed with my rosebud tea. And the reason for this is while we are still discussing the covenants, we're discussing the covenants in a slightly different way. There's kind of a thing that's changed with the covenants, and so there's a thing that's changed with today. We are talking about how all of these covenants, from Adam and Eden to David, have been fulfilled. All of these covenants had an element of promise to them, and they all are or will be fulfilled in their most ultimate form, even though we might have seen aspects of their fulfillment throughout. They will be fulfilled in their ultimate form through Jesus. All of these covenants have slowly revealed more and more about God's ultimate plan to redeem humanity, his ultimate redemption plan. First off, Adam and Eden. Whether or not you think that the Adam and Eden is a covenant or not, there is an element of there being a promise here that God fulfilled, and so we're still going to talk about it. And it's been a big theme throughout the covenant is the idea of this new Adam, the person who will come and correct and do what Adam was meant to do, but better. So create that new humanity, but better. It's kind of the idea of how there's this hope in many, or in one person or in a people group, that God makes covenants with, that they will be able to act as a new Adam. That's kind of the hope that's there with these covenants. However, all of them fall into sin as well, because they're all from Adam. However, Jesus does not. He never sins despite being tempted. So through that, Jesus is the second Adam. He is the true second Adam. He is creating a new humanity through what he does. So I'm not going to read out the Bible sections that really extrapolate this idea, but Paul talks about it a lot, particularly 1 Corinthians 15 and Romans 5. The promise here that is being fulfilled, regardless of whether or not it's a covenant, is the prophecy in Genesis 3:15. And I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your offspring and hers. He will crush your head, and you will strike his heel. Jesus came as the snake crusher. This is fulfilled in his death, where the snake bites his heel. The heel being like the Achilles heel almost of humanity, is our death and our sin. And so the snake bites his heel and he dies. But the head is successfully crushed because he rises again. This happens in his death and resurrection on the cross, of the biting of the heel but the crushing of the head. The second covenant that we talked about is Noah. Now, the way this covenant is fulfilled is interesting and isn't always the most obvious at first. God promised to Noah that he will never judge the earth through flood again. He will never judge the earth through a flood. This is fulfilled through Jesus, as he acts as the judge of the world. So God isn't judging through a flood, he's judging through himself. And at the end of the time, the judgment of the world will be seen through fire, which is talked about in Revelation, as opposed to water. So there is still a little bit here to be fulfilled, but it will still be fulfilled through Jesus. We saw the beginning of it being fulfilled in his death, and him taking on the judgment of God in that place. So we saw Jesus taking on the judgment of the world instead of, and the judgment for sins and the wrath of sins that caused God to flood the world. We saw him taking that on instead of him flooding the world again and getting rid of everything and starting afresh that way with somebody else new. So with all of these, we are focusing on the way that I think it's most clear that these covenants were fulfilled through Jesus. But there are probably many other ways that these were fulfilled, and I think that is probably true with Noah. But this is, I think, the way to me that is the most clear, is the idea of the judgment of the world. The third covenant we talked about was Abraham. Jesus fulfilled the breaking of God's covenant with Abraham. Abraham's covenant required that the person who passed through the pieces of the animals was essentially cut apart if this covenant was broken. despite God still being faithful to his covenant, it was broken due to Abraham's untrustworthiness of God, and through his generations' untrustworthiness of God. Through Jesus' death on the cross, he fulfilled this covenant promise, that he took on the weight of the mistakes that have been made since Abraham and from Abraham, and that being broken because he let that be done to him. He was broken on the cross. The fourth covenant we talked about is the covenant with Moses and Israel. A huge part of this covenant is the giving of the law. Much of the law is about defeating sin, and how being pure is not something we can achieve on our own, but requires God for us to be able to be clean because of the sin that is there. We are always a little bit corrupted. However, God needed Israel to be pure to dwell in their presence due to the sin, which is the same for us. We can't achieve no sin without God. We can't start walking in a life without sin, without God. And much of this purification that was done for Israel was done through sacrifice. Jesus then came, and his death on the cross was that sacrifice, the ultimate sacrifice that meant we no longer had to rely on those sacrifices to make us pure and clean, but by accepting the sacrifice that Jesus made for us, we become pure and clean. This stands for all time because of the nature of who is dying, and because God was able to pour out all his wrath and anger at the sin of the world and the sin of the people onto the death on the cross. That's where it was able to go. God no longer had to pour that out on people, and this extends backwards into history and forwards. This is a forever, outside of time, cosmic type of thing that is happening here. And that is a huge part of this, is that Jesus is the fulfillment of the law that was given by Moses. And one of the ways that he does that is through his sacrifice on the cross, is that fulfillment. And so Jesus saw himself as the law. He is the word, the law, the word. Jesus is the word. And he is now coming and bringing this new law that will be written on our hearts. He gives new commandments. There's in the greatest 2 commandments, and you read through a lot of the Sermon on the Mount, and a lot of that is new commandments, not only don't commit adultery, but do not lust. If you lust, then pick out your right eye, because if that caused you to stumble. He is giving these new commandments as well, but he is also saying the point is that these are unsustainable without me, without my sacrifice that I am going to make, that I am going to, if you let me, I will be with you, and we will not do this together, because it is not something that you can achieve without me. And that's the whole thing, is that Jesus comes as the fulfillment of the law, but also bringing this new law, not for us to be legalistic about, but for us to know that we can only achieve with Jesus. And so we have to work with Jesus. We have to be with God. We have to accept him to be able to do that. The last covenant that we talked about was the covenant with David. And this covenant is fulfilled because Jesus is from the line of David. Jesus is king. He was enthroned on the cross and at the crucifixion and his resurrection, and he sits on the throne. And we see that he is recognized as a king on Palm Sunday. We see him coming in to Jerusalem on the donkey, people recognizing him as the king, shouting Hosanna. It is fulfilled in the enthronement, which is his crucifixion. He is enthroned as king on the cross. When the cross is that is crucifixion, is where and the resurrection, that is where he declares the final victory, not the final victory, but the victory of God as king. And that is where he is king. He is crowned on the cross. However, there is still one more covenant that we haven't talked about. And why would I do this video talking about the fulfillment of the covenants when we haven't even finished talking about all of the covenants? Why would I do that? And that's because this isn't a covenant that Jesus kind of fulfilled. This is the covenant that he made. And that is the new covenant. The new covenant is the covenant that God has made through Jesus. that we are grafted into. We can't understand the new covenant without the old covenant, just as we can't understand the New Testament without the Old Testament. However, this whole new covenant business is a conversation for another time. Maybe in the next video. I'll see you all there. Bye!